My name is Juliet Foster. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words that sound kind but tend to make you invisible: steady, understanding, low maintenance. I'm a wife, a professional, a woman people assume will always smooth things over, the kind of person others talk around not to. If you met me before all of this, you probably wouldn't remember me 5 minutes later. And that's exactly how I learned to survive for a very long time. People often mistake calm for compliance. They think silence means agreement, that patience equals weakness. I've never raised my voice in public. I've never made scenes or ultimatums. I don't believe in revenge, and I've never believed in humiliating someone just to feel powerful. That's important for you to understand before we go any further, because this is not a story about rage. It's a story about clarity. What you're about to hear is how I used my husband's own social media account to expose his true face to everyone he knew. Not through lies, not through dramatics, and not through anything illegal or cruel. I didn't hack, impersonate, or invent. I simply let his own words speak in the order he had already chosen. With his lies laid out in his own language, the truth moved faster than any rumor ever could, leaving him to face the consequences in public, not behind closed doors. This story doesn't begin with betrayal. It begins with small, forgettable moments, the kind most people would brush off. A comment that lands slightly wrong, a joke that only works if one person absorbs the discomfort quietly. I absorbed a lot. I told myself that being easy to live with was a virtue, that love meant endurance, that dignity meant staying composed no matter how often you were overlooked. I want to be very clear. I'm not telling this story to shame anyone, not even him. I'm telling it because there's a specific kind of harm that happens when someone controls the narrative long enough, and a specific kind of justice that comes from letting reality stand on its own, unedited. Over the next hour or so, I'll walk you through who I was to the people around me, how I learned what I was never meant to see, and why silence, when chosen deliberately, can become the most decisive act a person ever makes. There are no heroes here, no villains drawn in thick lines, just a woman who stopped protecting a version of someone that wasn't real. If you've ever been underestimated because you stayed calm, if you've ever wondered whether telling the truth quietly could still change everything, let me ask you something gently before we begin. Have you ever felt invisible in a relationship you were holding together? To most people, I was the reliable one, not the exciting one, not the dramatic one, not the one whose absence would cause panic, but the one whose presence made everything run smoothly enough that no one ever asked how. I was the wife who remembered birthdays, smoothed over awkward dinners, and responded to group texts with polite warmth. At work, I was the person you could hand a problem to and trust it would disappear quietly. At home, I was the emotional buffer between moods, between conflicts, between my husband and the rest of the world. People didn't dislike me. That's the strange part. They liked me just enough to assume I didn't need much. My husband, Daniel, used to introduce me with a smile that sounded affectionate on the surface. "This is Juliet," he'd say. "She keeps everything together." Everyone laughed, nodded, and agreed. It was meant as praise. But over time, I noticed something. No one ever asked what I thought about anything afterward. When decisions were made, about vacations, finances, social plans, my role was already implied. I would adjust, I would accommodate, I would make it work. If I disagreed, I phrased it gently enough that it could be ignored without friction. And if it was ignored, I told myself that harmony mattered more than being heard. I became very good at disappearing without leaving the room. Friends saw me as calm. His colleagues saw me as supportive. His family saw me as easy. And Daniel, he saw me as safe, predictable, someone who would never disrupt the version of himself he liked to present. What no one saw was how closely I listened. I noticed the way conversations shifted when I entered, how jokes landed at my expense just lightly enough to be defensible, how my reactions were studied, not for understanding, but for tolerance. I learned which truths were welcome and which would make things uncomfortable, and I quietly retired the uncomfortable ones. I told myself this was adulthood, compromise, love without ego. But invisibility has a cost, and it compounds. Over time, I stopped being asked and started being informed. Plans were announced, not discussed. Opinions were summarized for me, often incorrectly. "You won't mind," Daniel would say, already moving forward, and I wouldn't, not outwardly. I learned how to nod in a way that looked like agreement but felt like resignation. The truth is, I wasn't silent because I was afraid. I was silent because I believed my restraint made me morally superior. I believed that if I stayed reasonable, the truth would eventually matter on its own. That if I never escalated, things would correct themselves. That belief shaped how everyone treated me. When someone believes you will absorb impact without complaint, they stop checking whether they're causing harm at all. I became the person people spoke to, not because they were cruel, but because they were comfortable. My presence required no adjustment. My reactions were safe. I didn't demand accountability, so none was offered. And Daniel thrived in that environment. He was admired, charismatic, online especially, he was articulate and thoughtful, someone people trusted. He spoke about values, honesty, and loyalty. I watched him perform that version of himself with ease, and I stood just outside the frame, smiling when appropriate, invisible when convenient. I don't blame people for not seeing me. I trained them not to. What I didn't realize then was that being underestimated is not the same as being powerless. It just takes longer for the difference to reveal itself. Because while everyone else was watching the man, he showed them. I was watching the gaps, the inconsistencies, the moments where his words changed depending on the audience. I wasn't collecting evidence, I wasn't planning anything. I was simply paying attention. And that, as it turns out, changes everything. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel. No one gasped or fell silent. In fact, if I described it to you out of context, it would sound harmless, maybe even funny. That's how these things usually begin. Not with a wound, but with a nick so small you convince yourself it doesn't deserve a reaction. We were at a small dinner with friends. Nothing formal, just people we'd known for years. Conversation drifted the way it always did, moving from work to travel to small complaints about aging. At one point, someone asked me a direct question. I don't even remember what it was now, only that I started to answer. Daniel interrupted me mid-sentence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at me. He simply continued, rephrasing my thought as if it were his own, adding a small joke at the end that earned a laugh. The moment passed in seconds. No one noticed anything wrong. I smiled because smiling was easier than correcting the room. But inside, something tightened. It wasn't that he spoke over me. We'd all done that to each other at times. It was the certainty with which he did it. The way his version replaced mine seamlessly, as if my words had only existed to set him up. The way the room responded to him, not to the idea itself. I told myself not to be sensitive. Later that night, I mentioned it casually, not an accusation, just an observation. You cut me off earlier, I said. I was answering that question. Daniel laughed, not unkindly. Oh, come on, he said. I was just helping you. You were rambling. That word stayed with me. Rambling. It implied something about me that I didn't recognize, but also couldn't immediately disprove. I replayed the moment in my head, searching for evidence that he was right. Had I hesitated? Had I gone on too long? The more I questioned myself, the easier it became to let the discomfort dissolve into doubt. That was the cut, not the interruption, the correction of my memory. After that, small moments began to accumulate. He'd summarize my opinion inaccurately in front of others. He'd tease me about being too emotional when I disagreed with him calmly. He'd tell stories about our life together that placed him at the center and me somewhere off to the side, vaguely supportive, faintly amused. Each time I considered speaking up, and each time I chose not to. Because nothing felt serious enough, because everyone else seemed comfortable, because challenging him would have created a tension no one else felt was necessary. I didn't want to be the person who made things awkward over something so minor, so I adjusted. I learned to pause before speaking, waiting for an opening that sometimes never came. I learned to keep my sentences short, polished, and interruption-proof. And when I was still cut off, I told myself it was a coincidence. What struck me most wasn't how he behaved, it was how quickly everyone else adapted to it. People began directing questions to him even when they were about me. They laughed when he teased. They nodded when he explained my own feelings back to me. And I watched myself become quieter, not because I had less to say, but because the effort to be heard began to outweigh the reward. I didn't mark these moments as warnings, I marked them as data. Not consciously, just emotionally, a faint record of when something didn't feel right, even if I couldn't yet name why. At the time, I still believed the story I'd always believed, that love meant patience, and patience meant letting small things go. I didn't yet understand that patterns don't announce themselves. They introduce themselves politely, then wait to see if you'll object. I didn't, and so the pattern stayed. What begins as an exception, if left unchallenged, slowly rewrites the rules. I didn't wake up one morning and decide that being dismissed was acceptable. It happened the way most emotional shifts do, incrementally, quietly, through repetition. Each small moment was easy to excuse on its own. Together, they formed something I no longer recognized as temporary. Daniel started finishing my sentences more often. At first, it was framed as intimacy. "We think the same way," he'd say, smiling, as if our minds were aligned, but the truth was simpler. His conclusions arrived faster because he didn't wait for mine. When I corrected him, he brushed it off. "You know what I meant," he'd say, and eventually I stopped correcting him at all. In group settings, my role solidified. I became the listener, the agreeable nod, the one who laughed at the right time. People stopped expecting contributions from me, and I stopped offering them. Not out of resentment, but out of efficiency. Speaking took effort. Silence cost less. I told myself I was choosing peace. When disagreements happened, they followed a familiar rhythm. I'd raise a concern calmly. Daniel would respond with a tone that suggested I was overreacting. Never outright dismissive, just gently corrective. "You're reading too much into it." "That's not what I meant. You're being sensitive today." None of those statements are accusations on paper, but they all share one effect. They relocate the problem from the behavior to the person noticing it. I began to question my own instincts. If I felt hurt, I asked myself whether the feeling was reasonable. If I felt dismissed, I wondered whether I'd earned the dismissal by being unclear or emotional. I became my own cross-examiner, challenging my reactions before anyone else had the chance to. And Daniel noticed, not consciously perhaps, but he noticed that I rarely pushed back. I accepted explanations more readily than apologies. I adjusted my expectations instead of asking him to adjust his behavior, so the dynamic deepened. He spoke for me more, decided for us more, framed disagreements as misunderstandings that required my flexibility, not his accountability. I rationalized all of it. "He's under stress. He doesn't mean it that way. This isn't worth a fight." Those thoughts became reflexes, protective in their own way. They allowed me to maintain the image of a stable marriage, a reasonable partnership. They also taught him that my boundaries were theoretical. The most unsettling part was how normal it began to feel. I didn't feel angry. I felt dull, like a radio turned down just enough that the music became background noise. I was still present, still functioning, but less vivid, less real. Friends would comment on how chill I was, how lucky Daniel was to have someone so understanding. I accepted the compliments with practiced ease, even as something in me receded further each time. I wasn't suffering in a dramatic sense. There were no scenes, no betrayals anyone could point to, just a slow erosion of presence. A quiet agreement I never formally made, that my perspective mattered less. And because I never protested loudly, the world adjusted accordingly. I told myself that love wasn't about keeping score. Mature relationships didn't require constant recalibration, that if something truly crossed a line, I would know. What I didn't understand then was that lines don't disappear all at once. They fade through use, stepped over often enough that you forget they were ever meant to stop anyone. By the time I noticed how far the pattern had gone, it already felt established, familiar, hard to challenge without sounding unreasonable. So I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because I had learned that my silence made things easier for everyone else. And at the time, I thought that made me good. Roles don't need to be announced to be enforced. By the time I realized I had one, it was already well rehearsed by everyone but me. I was the stabilizer, the one who didn't complicate things, the one whose reactions could be predicted with comforting accuracy. Daniel relied on that predictability. He would make plans without consulting me, confident I'd adapt. He'd commit our time, our space, sometimes even my labor, with a casual "Juliet won't mind." And I rarely did, at least not outwardly. Objecting felt like breaking character, like disrupting a story everyone else already believed. When I did hesitate, it was framed as an exception. "You're usually so easygoing," he'd say, not angrily, almost nostalgically, as if the version of me who disagreed was a temporary glitch. I began to understand that my value in the relationship wasn't tied to who I was, but to how little resistance I offered. At gatherings, people gravitated toward Daniel. He was animated, articulate, and confident. I hovered nearby, filling in gaps, refilling drinks, smoothing transitions, absorbing social friction before it could settle. I became part of the environment rather than a participant in it. No one asked me to do this. I simply noticed what kept things running smoothly and stepped into it. The more I fulfilled that role, the less room there was for anything else. I stopped sharing ideas that required explanation, stopped challenging narratives that placed me in the background. Not because I agreed, but because pushing against the role came with a cost, confusion, awkwardness, subtle disappointment from people who preferred me uncomplicated. Even my emotions were assigned parameters. If I was quiet, it was assumed I was content. If I expressed concern, it was labeled stress. If I disagreed, it was attributed to my mood. There was always an explanation that didn't require anyone to reconsider their assumptions, including Daniel. He spoke about honesty often, online especially, about transparency, accountability, and being misunderstood by people who didn't know the whole story. I watched those posts with a strange detachment. The man he described bore a strong resemblance to the man I lived with, if you didn't look too closely, and no one did. I realized then that the role I'd been assigned served a purpose. It allowed him to be admired without interruption. It allowed others to consume a version of our life that felt complete and uncomplicated. My presence validated that image. My silence protected it. That's when something in me shifted. Not emotionally, but cognitively. I stopped asking myself how to be heard. I started asking myself what I was seeing. I noticed how often Daniel's stories changed depending on the audience, how certain details were emphasized or omitted, how his online persona required constant reinforcement, and how effortlessly I had been drafted into maintaining it. I didn't confront him. I didn't announce a realization. I simply stopped volunteering pieces of myself to a role that no longer fit. I listened more than ever, observed, noted patterns, not to build a case, but to understand the system I was part of. Because once you see the role clearly, you also see its limits. And you begin to understand where the leverage actually is. The shift didn't arrive with anger. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic revelation. In fact, if you'd been watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything at all. That's what makes it difficult to explain. The moment that changes you isn't always visible. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was alone in the apartment, folding laundry. One of those mindless tasks that usually lets your thoughts drift without consequence. Daniel had stepped out earlier, his phone left on the kitchen counter to charge. That wasn't unusual. We shared space easily. There was trust, at least in the way trust is assumed when nothing has ever been openly questioned. A notification lit up the screen. I didn't reach for the phone right away. I wasn't curious in the way people imagine curiosity, sharp, intrusive. It was more like recognition. The name on the notification belonged to someone I didn't know, and the preview text carried a tone I recognized too well. Casual familiarity, the kind that implies context. I told myself to keep folding, but something in me paused, not out of suspicion, but out of clarity. A quiet understanding that if I looked away in that moment, I would be choosing not to know. And I was tired of choosing that. So I picked up the phone. I didn't scroll. I didn't dig. I simply opened what had already announced itself. The message wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. It contradicted something Daniel had told me days earlier, something small, easily forgettable. That contradiction landed differently than I expected. I didn't feel shocked. I felt alignment. Suddenly, dozens of small moments snapped into place. The inconsistencies, the narrative shifts, the confidence with which he spoke publicly about honesty. None of it felt confusing anymore. It felt coherent. I set the phone down exactly where it had been and finished folding the laundry. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. The world hadn't tilted, but something fundamental had recalibrated. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was imagining things. I didn't confront him when he came home. I didn't test him with questions. I watched, listened, and noticed how easily the version of events he offered slid into place. Smooth, plausible, incomplete. That was the moment I understood something important. The truth wasn't hidden. It was curated, and I had been protecting the curation. That realization didn't hurt the way betrayal is supposed to hurt. It clarified. It freed me from the exhausting work of self-doubt. I no longer needed to interpret, excuse, or translate. I didn't become colder. I became precise. From that day on, my silence changed texture. It was no longer avoidance. It was a selection. I chose when to speak and when not to maintain harmony, but to observe reality without interference. I didn't yet know what I would do with what I was seeing. I only knew that I would no longer edit myself to preserve a story that wasn't true. And that knowledge, quiet as it was, shifted everything. After that afternoon, nothing about my behavior changed on the surface. And that was the point. I still showed up, still smiled at the right moments, still listened. But internally, something fundamental had inverted. My silence was no longer a reflex designed to keep things smooth. It became intentional, strategic, a way of letting patterns complete themselves without interruption. When you stop correcting someone, they reveal how much they rely on being corrected. Daniel grew more confident. His explanations became looser, his stories more embellished. Without my quiet resistance, his narrative flowed freely. He filled in gaps I used to question, made assumptions I used to soften. He mistook my stillness for acceptance. Others did too. Friends commented on how easy things seemed between us, how relaxed I was. I nodded, knowing that calm can mean many things, and not all of them are surrender. I started noticing how often Daniel used certainty as a substitute for truth, how quickly he spoke when he didn't want to be questioned, how his public voice, online especially, relied on consistency while his private behavior drifted. I haven't documented yet. I didn't plan. I simply let him talk. Silence, when chosen deliberately, creates space. And in that space, people tend to say more than they should. He shared details casually that contradicted previous claims. He forgot which version he'd told me. He assumed I wasn't tracking anything, because I never had before. That assumption became his blind spot. What surprised me most was how peaceful I felt. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I felt present, grounded, as if I had stepped out of a fog I hadn't realized I was in. For years, my silence had been about shrinking. Now it was about clarity. I began to understand that confrontation wasn't required for truth to emerge. In fact, confrontation often stops it. People become defensive, they adjust, they retreat into rehearsed versions of themselves. I wanted the unrehearsed one, so I listened without reacting, asked neutral questions, let inconsistencies stand without comment. I watched how quickly reality surfaced when no one rushed to smooth it over. Daniel mistook my calm for weakness. He leaned into it, spoke more freely online, posted more confidently about values he no longer practiced privately. He didn't realize that his words, left unchallenged, were beginning to form a record, not because I was collecting it, because he was publishing it. I didn't yet know what I would do with that record. I only knew that for the first time, my silence belonged to me. And that made all the difference. What people don't realize about being underestimated is that it creates room. Room to observe without scrutiny. Room to learn without interference. Room to prepare without being suspected of anything at all. While everyone else assumed I was simply being agreeable, quiet, supportive, unchanged, I was doing something very different. I was paying attention to system, not just Daniel's behavior, but the structures around it. How information moved, where stories were reinforced, how his online presence functioned like an ecosystem. Posts, comments, private messages, reactions. I didn't think of it as exposure or evidence. I thought of it as literacy, learning the language of the world he was fluent in. I noticed how often his social media accounts acted as extensions of his personality, how casually he used them to shape perception. He posted thoughtfully worded reflections about integrity, about being misunderstood, about loyalty. People responded warmly. They trusted him. They quoted him. They shared his words as if they carried weight, and he believed they did. What no one noticed was how little he guarded those words at home. He'd draft posts out loud, asking my opinion without really listening to it. He'd leave accounts logged in, notifications visible. He assumed privacy because he assumed loyalty, and he assumed loyalty because I had never challenged him before. I didn't violate his trust. I didn't need to. Everything I saw was already being shared, just not all with the same audience. I began to understand the power of consistency, or rather, the danger of inconsistency when someone believes no one is tracking it. Statements made in one context contradicted those in another. Promises implied online were quietly abandoned offline. Narratives shifted depending on who was listening. And because I no longer corrected or clarified, those contradictions accumulated. I started keeping notes, not of feelings, but of facts, dates, phrases, context, not obsessively, calmly, methodically, the same way you might keep records for a project you don't yet fully understand. There was no rush, no urgency. I wasn't building toward a reveal. I was simply allowing reality to assemble itself. What struck me was how easy it was. Not because Daniel was careless, but because he was confident. He believed the version of himself he projected was coherent enough to withstand scrutiny. He believed no one close to him would ever apply that scrutiny, least of all me. I watched how quickly people defended him online, how they filled in the gaps on his behalf, how his words were interpreted generously, even when they were vague or self-serving. And I understood something essential. The truth wouldn't need amplification. It would only need alignment. The right words, in the right order, spoken by the right voice. His voice. I didn't feel powerful in that realization. I felt responsible. Because once you see how narratives are built, you also see how easily they collapse under their own weight if you simply stop holding them up. And I stopped. I didn't change my demeanor. I didn't hint at knowledge. I let everyone believe I was still the same woman, supportive, invisible, harmless. That belief gave me time, and time, when combined with attention, becomes leverage. The reveal didn't come with excitement. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of triumph. It arrived quietly, like a conclusion you reach not because you're searching for it, but because enough pieces have finally arranged themselves into something undeniable. I was alone again. Early one morning, scrolling absently while drinking coffee. Daniel had already left for the day. One of his accounts, still logged in on the shared tablet, showed a conversation thread I hadn't seen before. Not hidden, not protected, simply there among many others. This time I didn't hesitate. What I read wasn't shocking in isolation. It wasn't explicit, illegal, or dramatic. In fact, that's what made it so revealing. The tone he used, measured, reassuring, self-justifying, was identical to the tone he used publicly. The difference was context. Here, the contradictions were no longer spread across platforms or audiences. They sat side by side. Promises made to different people that couldn't all be true at once. Values articulated publicly that were quietly negotiated away in private. Statements about loyalty that shifted depending on who needed reassurance. And suddenly, the pattern was complete. I didn't feel betrayed in the cinematic sense. I felt something closer to finality, like finishing a book you'd been reading for years without realizing it was a mystery. The ending didn't surprise me. It explained everything that came before it. I took screenshots, not emotionally, not impulsively, just enough to preserve what already existed. Dates visible, usernames clear, no commentary, no annotations. I wasn't building a case, I was preserving context. Then I stopped. I didn't keep digging. I didn't spiral. I didn't confront him that evening or the next. I closed the tablet and went about my day exactly as planned, as keys. Because what I had discovered wasn't leverage in the way people imagine leverage. It wasn't something to wield. It was something to stop protecting. For years, I had buffered the distance between who Daniel said he was and how he behaved. I explained away gaps, softened edges, gave him the benefit of my doubt even when it cost me clarity. Now I didn't need to do that anymore. The truth didn't require exposure yet, it required patience. I realized then that the most powerful thing I could do was nothing, at least for the moment. Let him continue, let the record grow naturally, let his own words accumulate without interference. Because when the time came, there would be no argument about intent, no debate about interpretation, no accusation that could be reframed as emotion. There would only be alignment, and alignment doesn't need volume to be devastating. That night, Daniel talked about his day. I listened. He referenced a conversation I had already seen documented differently. I nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of reality. I slept better than I had in months, because clarity, once it arrives, is deeply restful. Clarity creates options. Once you see the full shape of something, you can no longer pretend you're trapped inside it. You may still choose to stay, but the choice becomes conscious. And that changes the weight of everything. After the private reveal, I began quietly mapping my options. Not emotionally, practically. I didn't rush because there was no urgency anymore. The panic that drives impulsive decisions had dissolved. I wasn't reacting to betrayal. I was responding to information. One option was confrontation. Sit him down, lay everything out, demand explanations. I knew how that would go. He would apologize selectively, reframe timelines, emphasize intentions over impact. And because I had been calm for so long, my sudden clarity would be treated as instability, an overreaction, a phase. Another option was departure. Clean, quiet, final. Leave without explanation and let him wonder. That had a certain appeal, but it would leave the narrative intact. He would tell the story, I would disappear into it as the inexplicable ending. There was also the option I had been exercising unconsciously for years, staying silent and absorbing the cost. I understood that option intimately. I knew exactly what it would take from me, and for the first time, I knew with certainty that I would not choose it again. The option that remained was the most uncomfortable and the most precise. Do nothing publicly, change everything privately, stop shielding the narrative, stop correcting assumptions, stop editing his words for safety. Let the truth exist in the same spaces where the performance had lived. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to embarrass him. I wanted alignment between who he claimed to be and what he had actually said and done, using only his own language. That decision took time, not because it was difficult, but because it was irreversible. Once the narrative shifted, it wouldn't return, and I needed to be sure that I could live with the consequences of that shift. So I waited. I reviewed what I had, not to relive it, but to understand its scope. I asked myself one question repeatedly. If this were shown without commentary, without framing, would it still matter? The answer was yes, because the power wasn't in exposure, it was in contrast. Public words, private contradictions, side by side. No accusation required. That was the moment I chose. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet internal commitment to stop participating in a story that depended on my silence to survive. I didn't yet know exactly how or when things would unfold. I only knew that I would no longer intervene to prevent the truth from standing on its own. And once that decision was made, everything else became a matter of timing. Once the decision was made, the work didn't feel heavy. That surprised me. I had expected grief or fear, or at least a sense of loss. Instead, what I felt was focus, the kind that arrives when you're no longer arguing with reality and finally start cooperating with it. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy, it's about alignment. I didn't announce changes because I wasn't trying to send a message. I wasn't signaling independence or preparing a reveal. I was simply rearranging my life so that it no longer depended on someone else's honesty. The first changes were internal. I stopped anticipating Daniel's needs before my own. That had been such a reflex that it took effort to notice it happening. The instinct to smooth, to buffer, to preempt discomfort was deeply ingrained. Now, when it surfaced, I paused. Asked myself whether the effort served reality or just preserved appearances. Most of the time, it was the latter. So I let things be slightly less smooth. I didn't remind him of appointments that weren't mine. I didn't translate his moods into explanations. I didn't soften his words after he said them, not out of spite, out of neutrality. I let him experience the full shape of his own behavior without my intervention. He didn't notice. That was the lesson I kept learning over and over again. How much labor disappears without comment when it's no longer being provided. On a practical level, I began disentangling what had been casually merged. Finances first, not because I planned to leave immediately, but because clarity matters. I reviewed accounts, obligations, and shared responsibilities. I made copies of documents and stored them somewhere accessible only to me. Not to hide them, but to know where they were. Knowledge creates steadiness. I updated passwords on my personal accounts, not aggressively, not defensively, just enough to establish that some things belonged to me alone. I rerouted correspondence, organized files, quiet, boring tasks that didn't look like preparation to anyone else, but felt like grounding to me. Daniel didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The version of me he believed in didn't require explanation. I was still pleasant, still present, still predictable. That predictability worked in my favor. I also started asking questions, carefully, selectively. Not questions that revealed motive, but ones that gathered information, hypotheticals, clarifications. I listened to the answers without reacting, letting them settle alongside what I already knew. There was no rush to connect dots publicly. They were already connected privately. What I found most revealing during this period was how little resistance there was. No obstacles, no confrontations, no moments where I had to justify myself. The system I was stepping out of had been sustained largely by my participation. Once I withdrew that energy, it continued on inertia alone. At the same time, Daniel's online presence grew more confident. He posted more frequently. Longer reflections, statements about values, about loyalty, about truth. People responded with affirmation, encouragement, gratitude. I watched those interactions with a strange sense of distance, not bitterness, not anger, more like witnessing a structure you once lived inside from the outside for the first time. I stopped engaging with his posts altogether. No likes, no comments, no subtle reinforcement. I didn't announce that shift either. I let it be noticed, or not. Mostly it wasn't. That told me something important. My public support had been assumed, not appreciated. Its absence didn't register as a loss, only as neutrality. And neutrality, I was learning, is powerful. In conversations with others, I adjusted my language. When people asked about Daniel, I didn't embellish, I didn't contextualize, I didn't defend. I answered plainly, without commentary. If someone misunderstood, I didn't rush to correct them. I let people sit with their own interpretations. This wasn't manipulation, it was a restraint. For years, I had been managing perception. Now, I stopped. And in that absence, reality began doing the work on its own. I also began reclaiming time, small pockets at first. The time I used to dedicate to managing our shared life now belonged to me. I used it to think, to read, to walk without a destination, to remember what my own thoughts sounded like when they weren't filtered through someone else's expectations. There was a quiet rebuilding happening that no one else could see. I noticed how often Daniel spoke in absolutes online, how certain he sounded, how coherent his narrative appeared, and I noticed how little he questioned it privately, assuming consistency where none existed. That assumption became another blind spot, because while he was performing certainty, I was practicing detachment. And detachment makes room for precision. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't imagine confrontations. I focused on readiness. Emotional, logistical, ethical. I wanted to be sure that whatever happened next, whenever it happened, I wouldn't need to rush, justify, or collapse. Silence gave me that. It gave me space to act without spectacle, to prepare without announcing, to step out of a role without demanding recognition for leaving it. From the outside, nothing looked different. We still shared meals, still exchanged updates, still occupied the same rooms. But the center of gravity had shifted. I was no longer orienting myself around him. I was orienting myself around truth. And once that happens, the rest becomes inevitable. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with confrontation or punishment or raised voices. They arrive quietly, disguised as inconvenience, as confusion, as the subtle discomfort that comes from realizing something you relied on is no longer there, and you're not sure when it left. When I stopped compensating for Daniel, the world didn't explode. It simply stopped bending around him. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible. The kind of things you notice only if you're paying attention, and Daniel wasn't. He had never needed to be. Things had always worked. People had always responded. Conversations had always flowed. He moved through his life with the confidence of someone who believed the systems around him were natural, not maintained. The first sign was timing. Replies came later than usual. Emails lingered unanswered. Group chats stalled. Nothing dramatic, just delays. The sort of delays that suggest priority has shifted elsewhere. Daniel mentioned it casually one evening, scrolling through his phone. "People are so slow lately," he said, half laughing, as if it were a minor annoyance. I nodded. In the past, I would have offered an explanation. People are busy. It's that time of year. Everyone's overwhelmed. I would have smoothed the moment, restored his sense of normalcy. This time, I didn't. Without that reassurance, the silence lingered longer than he expected. Small misunderstandings began to accumulate. A plan he assumed was confirmed turned out not to be. A conversation he thought had ended clearly resurfaced with confusion attached to it. He found himself having to clarify things I used to anticipate. That was the first real consequence. Effort. Not overwhelming effort. Just enough to be noticeable. Just enough to feel unfamiliar. Daniel had grown used to moving forward without resistance, used to being interpreted generously, used to having the emotional friction handled somewhere behind the scenes. When that friction surfaced directly in front of him, he didn't recognize it as a consequence. He saw it as an inconvenience, as other people failed to meet his expectations. He didn't consider that something had changed on his end. At home, his energy shifted. He became more talkative, filling space with explanations no one had asked for. He recounted conversations in greater detail, emphasizing how reasonable he'd been, how unclear others had seemed. He sought affirmation without explicitly requesting it. In the past, I would have supplied it instinctively. I listened instead. Online, the changes were slower, but more revealing. His posts still appeared polished, thoughtful, articulate, but the engagement beneath them began to thin. Fewer people echoed his language. fewer comments reinforcing his perspective. The warmth that had once greeted his reflections cooled into neutrality. Not disagreement, not criticism, distance. That kind of shift is unsettling precisely because it can't be argued with. There's no accusation to refute, no enemy to confront, just a gradual sense that the room is no longer leaning in. Daniel began checking his notifications more frequently, refreshing pages, revisiting posts to reread responses. He didn't say anything about this directly, but I noticed the rhythm of it, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way he exhaled when a new comment appeared, and how quickly that relief faded. Confidence, when it's real, doesn't require constant confirmation. His did. The most telling changes happened in social settings. Invitations became less frequent, not stopped, just spaced further apart. Conversations that once flowed easily ended sooner. People seemed distracted, their attention divided. Daniel compensated by speaking more, filling gaps with certainty. It didn't land the way it used to. I watched as people began to ask clarifying questions where they once nodded, as they responded with polite acknowledgement instead of enthusiasm, as they let his statements stand without affirmation. None of this was hostile. That's what made it so effective. Hostility can be dismissed, neutrality cannot. Daniel started to feel it before he understood it. He mentioned feeling off, said things felt different lately. Those people seemed harder to read. He wondered aloud whether something had changed culturally, whether everyone was just more distant now. I let the question hang. In the past, I would have helped him locate the discomfort somewhere external: stress, work, the world, anything but himself. Anything but the system that had been quietly sustained by my participation. Without that buffer, he was exposed to the full weight of his own interactions, and they were heavier than he realized. What struck me most during this period was how little it took for things to shift. I hadn't corrected anyone, hadn't revealed anything, hadn't withdrawn publicly or privately in a way that could be named. I had simply stopped intervening, and that was enough. The narrative Daniel had built, online and offline, relied on consistency, on reinforcement, on someone quietly aligning the edges so the center appeared solid. Without that alignment, the contradictions didn't explode. They surfaced. People didn't turn against him, they drifted. They didn't accuse him, they paused. And pauses, when they happen at scale, change the temperature of a room. Daniel responded the only way he knew how, by reinforcing his message. His posts grew longer, more explicit, more insistent. He clarified his values repeatedly, as if repetition could restore resonance. He explained himself preemptively, defended positions no one had openly challenged. The effort showed. An effort, when it replaces ease, invites scrutiny. I watched this without satisfaction. That's important to say. There was no pleasure in seeing him unsettled, no sense of victory. What I felt was recognition. The quiet confirmation that what I had sensed for years was real. His stability had been collaborative, and I had been doing more of the collaboration than I knew. Without me absorbing uncertainty, he had to sit with it himself. Without my smoothing perception, others had to form their own. Without me translating his intentions, his words had to stand on their own. They did not stand as firmly as he believed. One evening, he asked me directly whether I thought people were misreading him. The question was framed lightly, but there was urgency beneath it. He wanted reassurance, alignment, confirmation that the world, not him, was out of step. I considered my answer carefully. I think people respond to what they experience, I said. Nothing more. He nodded, but I could see the confusion in his face. That answer didn't give him anything to hold on to. It didn't absolve him. It didn't accuse him. It simply reflected reality. And reality, when you're not used to confronting it unfiltered, can feel destabilizing. By then, the consequences were no longer subtle. They still weren't public, still weren't dramatic, but they were cumulative. 100 small absences add up to a noticeable loss of momentum. A structure that still stood, but no longer felt secure. And through it all, I remained calm. Not because I was detached, but because I was no longer resisting what was happening. I wasn't trying to steer outcomes or accelerate consequences. I trusted the process I had stepped out of. The truth was already doing its work, quietly, relentlessly. All I had done was stop getting in its way. There is a moment, quiet, unmistakable, when someone realizes they are no longer in control of the story. Not because the truth has been shouted, not because they've been confronted with evidence, but because the responses they rely on stop arriving. The certainty they once moved with begins to fail them. and they can't trace exactly when that power slipped out of their hands. That moment came for Daniel slowly. At first, he tried to fix things the way he always had, by talking, by explaining, by clarifying his intentions more carefully, more thoroughly. He assumed misunderstanding was the problem, because misunderstanding had always been something he could correct. But the more he explained, the less effective it became. People listened politely, responded with neutral acknowledgement, didn't argue, but didn't affirm either. The energy he was used to receiving simply wasn't there, and without resistance to push against, his words hung in the air, unsupported. At home, the shift became impossible to ignore. He asked more questions, not directly about me, about everything. Whether something seemed off lately, whether people were just more distant now, whether I thought he'd said something wrong without realizing it. Each question carried a quiet urgency. In the past, I would have rushed to soothe it, to locate the discomfort somewhere external, to restore equilibrium. This time, I didn't. I answered honestly but sparingly. I didn't speculate. I didn't reassure him that nothing was wrong. I let uncertainty remain where it belonged. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. He began revisiting old conversations, replaying them out loud, searching for missteps. He asked me how things came across, whether certain statements might have been interpreted differently than he intended. The confidence that once defined him softened into something more brittle. What he didn't realize was that it was already too late to correct anything, because the issue was no longer what he said. It was how consistently his words no longer aligned. Online, his posts became defensive without naming a threat. He spoke about being misjudged, about how people often confuse clarity with arrogance, about how intentions matter more than perception. The subtext was clear, but the response wasn't. Fewer comments, shorter ones. Some people disengaged entirely, others offered polite encouragement without enthusiasm. The feedback loop he depended on had weakened, and he didn't know how to restore it. That's when panic entered the room. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to alter his behavior. He checked his phone constantly, scrolled, refreshed, reread. His mood became more reactive. He oscillated between self-assurance and doubt, sometimes within the same conversation. He tried to pull me back in, asked for my opinion more frequently, sought validation indirectly. "You know me," he'd say. "You know what I'm like." He wanted me to reaffirm the version of himself that was slipping. I didn't refuse. I simply didn't supply it. Instead, I listened, observed, let him sit with the uncertainty I had carried for years. Let him experience what it feels like to question your own narrative without immediate relief. At one point, he asked me directly if I thought something was wrong. I met his eyes, calm, present, unemotional. Unemotional. "I think things are catching up," I said. He didn't ask what I meant, not because he understood, but because he was afraid of the answer. From that moment on, his attempts to fix things became increasingly frantic. He adjusted his tone, changed his phrasing, tried to appear more measured, more reflective. But it was all happening too late, after the trust he relied on had already begun to erode. Because trust doesn't collapse in response to one revelation. It collapses when patterns become visible. And once people see a pattern clearly, they don't need proof. They don't need confirmation. They simply stop leaning in. By the time Daniel realized this, the damage wasn't dramatic, but it was irreversible. He could speak, but his words no longer anchored reality. And without that anchor, everything he tried to fix only drifted further. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was quiet. No raised voices. No accusations thrown like weapons. No moment anyone could point to and say, "That's when everything broke." By then, things had already shifted too far for a single conversation to carry that kind of weight. Daniel asked to talk one evening after dinner. His tone was careful, rehearsed. He chose his words the way someone does when they already sense the ground is unstable. We sat across from each other at the table we'd shared for years, the space between us calm but altered. "I feel like you've been distant," he said. Not angry, not defensive, just uncertain. I didn't deny it. Denial would have been another form of protection. "I've been paying attention," I said. That answer unsettled him more than anything else could have. He waited for elaboration that didn't come. For emotion, he could respond to. For blame, he could deflect. Instead, there was only stillness. He tried again. Asked if I was upset, if he'd done something wrong, if there was something he needed to fix. Each question circled the same assumption, that the problem could be resolved if only it were clearly named. I let him speak. When I finally responded, my voice was steady, measured. I don't think this is about fixing one thing, I said. I think it's about seeing what's already there. He frowned. Not in anger, in confusion. The kind that comes when familiar strategies stop working. He asked whether I trusted him. That question had always carried weight between us. In the past, it would have pulled me toward reassurance. This time, I answered honestly. I trust what I can verify, I said. The room went very still. I didn't accuse him. I didn't reference messages, posts, or contradictions. I didn't need to. The conversation wasn't about evidence, it was about alignment, and he could feel the absence of it. He started explaining, not confessing, explaining. He talked about intentions, about being misunderstood, about how things look different from the inside. He spoke carefully, watching my face for reaction. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. I believe you're sincere, I said. I also believe sincerity isn't the same as consistency. That was the moment he understood that this wasn't an argument he could win. There was nothing to rebut, no claim to dismantle, no emotion to soothe, just a calm boundary where my silence used to be. He asked what I wanted. I took my time answering. I want to stop pretending, I said. I want my life to reflect what's true, not what's convenient. He didn't argue with that. He couldn't. The conversation ended the way it began, quietly. No resolution announced, no dramatic conclusion, just the mutual recognition that something essential had changed. We both stood up, went to separate rooms, lived in the same space with a new understanding. The story we'd shared no longer held, and neither of us could force it back into place. I'm often asked, implicitly, not directly, whether I feel different now. People don't phrase it that way, of course. They ask how I'm doing, whether things feel lighter, whether I'm relieved. They're searching for a transformation they can recognize, a visible shift, some sign that the story ended with a clear emotional conclusion. But the truth is quieter than that. I didn't become someone new. I returned to someone I had been editing for a very long time. What changed wasn't my personality, it was my position. I no longer stand slightly to the side of my own life, adjusting myself to fit someone else's narrative. I take up the space my experiences require, without apology or explanation. There's no bitterness in that. I don't speak about Daniel publicly. I don't correct people's assumptions unless they matter. I don't feel the need to clarify what happened in detail. The truth exists where it needs to exist. It doesn't require my supervision anymore. What I've gained isn't power over someone else. It's power over my own alignment. I trust myself now in a way I didn't before. Not because I was proven right, but because I stopped proving myself wrong. I no longer interrogate my instincts until they collapse into doubt. I listen to them, I verify, and then I act accordingly. That changes how you move through the world. Conversations feel different when you're not managing perception. Relationships feel cleaner when you're not performing stability. Silence feels spacious instead of heavy. I'm calmer than I've ever been, not because my life is simpler, but because it's honest. I don't romanticize what happened. There are losses I didn't anticipate. Familiar structures fell away. Some connections changed shape. But nothing that was left was aligned with who I actually am. And that matters. People who meet me now often describe me as grounded, present. They say I seem certain, not loud, just steady. I recognize that version of myself. She's always been here. She was just waiting for permission to stop shrinking. If there's one thing I understand now, it's this. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Silence doesn't mean absence. And restraint, when chosen deliberately, can be the most decisive act there is. I didn't need to expose anyone dramatically. I simply stopped participating in what wasn't true. And that was enough. There's a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to frame everything as victory or defeat, to decide who won, who lost, who was exposed and who was redeemed. But real life doesn't resolve itself that cleanly, and neither did this. What happened wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about revenge or public humiliation or even justice in the way we usually define it. No one was dragged into the light against their will. No secrets were invented or exaggerated. Nothing was forced. I didn't do anything to my husband. I stopped doing something for him. And that distinction matters more than people realize. For years, I believed being good meant being quiet. That integrity meant absorbing discomfort so others could remain comfortable. That if I stayed reasonable enough, patient enough, the truth would eventually sort itself out. What I learned instead is that truth doesn't need champions, but it does need space. When you protect someone's narrative at the expense of your own reality, you don't create peace. You create distortion, and distortion always collapses eventually, not because someone exposes it, but because it can't sustain itself forever. I didn't expose Daniel by speaking louder than him. I exposed the gap between who he said he was and what he actually said, using only his own words, in the order he chose to share them. That's not cruelty. That's alignment. And alignment has consequences. Some people were surprised. Some were disappointed. Some quietly adjusted their understanding without ever mentioning it. There were no dramatic confrontations, no viral moments, no public reckoning anyone could point to. Just a recalibration. And that's the kind of outcome I can live with. Because what I wanted, what I still want, isn't for someone else to fall. It's for myself to stand without shrinking. If there's a moral here, it isn't be silent or expose everything. It's this: pay attention to patterns, to inconsistencies, to the cost of your own restraint. Silence can be a refuge, or it can be a cage. The difference is whether it's chosen. And when silence becomes a choice, it becomes power. Not the loud kind, not the kind that dominates others, the kind that reclaims yourself. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been the person smoothing things over, holding things together, staying quiet so someone else could stay admired, I'd really like to hear from you. What's one truth you stopped protecting, and how did that change your life?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ